Time. The answer is time.
22-year-old Matthew Griffiths was on watch when the storm hit the superyacht. Griffiths told prosecutors, quote, "I woke the captain," that's James Cutfield, woke him up when the wind was blowing at 20 knots. He ordered to wake everyone else up, end quote. Now, we don't know who was ordered, whether those orders were followed, and if they were, to what extent they were. It seems certain that at least half a dozen passengers weren't woken up. And this raises a very interesting question. How was it possible to sleep through a storm that was supposedly a tornado-wrecking Tempesta Anomala?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, a witness who wanted to stay anonymous said the following: "I could see both yachts and the lights of the Bayesian mast were lit up," she told the Sunday Times. "I also noticed that the sea was calm despite the wind and rain." So we seem to have a scenario here of a storm and calm, which could explain some hyper-localized phenomena like a waterspout. A similar scenario played out when Titanic struck a North Atlantic iceberg shortly before midnight at 11:40 p.m. while traveling at a speed of 20.5 knots. The impact was so slight, if you were somewhere else on the ship, all you would feel was a mere vibration. And it was so slight that passengers had to be woken up and alerted that something serious had happened. Think about it as well. A iceberg is also kind of like a localized thing. One ship can be struck, whereas another one not. And so the white-whiskered captain of the Titanic is popularly imagined to have woken up as well, although there isn't consensus on this issue. But what about the rest of the timeline? Now, according to a local publication, quote, "In addition to the storm and the powerful gusts of wind that contributed to the vessel's destabilization and sinking, experts have also pointed to human error as a possible cause of the Bayesian's demise. There is talk of a chain of mistakes, including open hatches and windows, improper alignment of the vessel, and poor positioning of the keel, the counterweight to the soaring mast. All of these issues could have resulted from a late start, meaning crew, including the captain, that awakened to the reality of the storm either late or too late." Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera has obtained details of the final 16 minutes of the Bayesian thanks to the AIS, the Automatic Identification System, the tracking system which links a ship's onboard instruments to coastal stations and accurately tracks the vessel. In this analysis, we want to look at that sort of hallowed aspect, one of the pillars of true crime, which is the timeline. And this is probably the most comprehensive timeline you have seen, even if you've been studying the case quite closely. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the many of you who have subscribed. If you find this compilation of the timeline worthwhile, valuable, meaningful, interesting, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So the final moments of the Bayesian. I'm not sure whether the timeline should begin on Monday morning or Sunday night. What do you think? When do we start the timeline? I suppose one could even start the timeline when the boat was built and go into the decisions that went into that. One could even begin when the crew were hired, or even the trial that Mike Lynch was going through, and then the result was going on this trip and celebrating. But it is fairly certain that the night before the incident, the ship's crew and passengers were celebrating, aka partying. We saw a similar situation in the Jay Slater case. We saw how important context is. We saw how important it was to the 19-year-old's disappearance in Tenerife. And in that case, the context was 3 days and nights of revelry, preceding disaster. Aren't we dealing with something similar here? In any event, we're going to kick off our timeline on Sunday at 9:30 p.m. So signs of this storm were apparently evident as early as 9:30 p.m. from the night before. Now, what is a little bit tricky with the timeline is a lot of the sources I've referenced are actually from local news sources that have got to be translated, and so they're not that available or accessible compared to other mainstream media sources. And what is really interesting with these local sources is there's just a little bit more detail, a little bit more context. So a witness who was in the area states that the bad weather began already around 9:30 p.m. local time, but that the people on the yacht were still celebrating, even though there were lightning flashes. He mentions that he saw the Bayesian and a smaller vessel by her side. The word used is panfilo, which means another yacht or similar vessel, so he's most likely not talking about the Bayesian's tender. He may have seen the Sir Robert Baden-Powell. That does make sense. A designer employed by Perini said a door or opening on the side of the vessel must have been left open after the celebration. 10 p.m. This image of the Bayesian was taken at around 10 p.m. on Sunday night. Now, if you look closely, does it look like one of the main hatches is open? Can one actually see the tender from this position? Or was the tender, had it left and was, at the harbour? And that's another aspect. What was the tender's movements that night? We also know local weather reports warned of a thunderstorm sufficient to keep local fishermen at home and in bed rather than out in their boats that morning. And now we jump to 3:50 a.m. A waterspout strikes the Bayesian. Despite being anchored, the tracking system shows a path that visually resembles a scribble. The yacht moves forward and backward, then side to side, and then once more forward and backward. Now, although this erratic movement seems to correspond to the notion of a waterspout, there is also at least one alternative explanation. Some accounts indicate the craft was being pulled against the weight of its anchor. According to the Times, quote, Rosalia Orlando, 73, the owner of another shipyard which also captured the sinking on its CCTV, was awake at the time. I saw what happened with my own eyes, she said. The boat was moving and swinging as if it was trembling. Maybe it was the anchor that was pulling it, I don't know, she said. I also saw the sails slam against each other and the main mast moving to the other side. Now we go to 3:59 a.m. At this point, the anchor gives way, leaving the yacht fully exposed to the storm. Did you know about that aspect? The anchor giving way at 1:04 in the morning. And this was a decisive moment. Once the anchor gave way, it's likely the vessel turned sharply and possibly tossed passengers and crew into the water. 4 a.m. By this time, the yacht is taking on so much water that it is becoming unmanageable. The power goes out, indicating that water has reached either the generator area or the engine room. Now, the combination of the yacht whiplashing against the anchor and then losing power could explain why the vessel was basically dead in the water, and also why the other vessel was able to survive the way that it did. What is missing from the scenario is the crew doing anything to direct the yacht through the storm. There seems to be no anticipation of the storm that we saw in the nearby vessels, including and especially starting the engines. While one can say that the storm struck too suddenly to do anything, the reality is that the other captain anticipated the storm and acted in time. Ironically, Karsten Borner doesn't feel the Bayesian crew were at fault at all. Is he right? According to the Times, quote, Karsten Borner, the captain of the Sir Robert Baden-Powell, the Dutch yacht that was anchored between 100 and 150 meters from the Bayesian, he said, and this should be emphasized, he was aware that thunderstorms were predicted, but chose the berth because it was protected to the west and north. They couldn't do anything. It was way too quick. They did what they could. You know it can happen. Also, the Titanic was said to be unsinkable. I don't think they made any mistakes. I mean, this is a question of the Coast Guard and the prosecutors to find out what really happened, but I personally can't see any fault. I don't believe they're stupid to leave the hatch of the tender open. Those are the other captain's words. Now, it might not be a question of intelligence. It might be a question of being under the influence, because the open hatch would explain the speed at which the boat lost power and sank, and also why the crew didn't have time to effect an alert, let alone a rescue. 4:03 a.m. At 4:03 a.m. there's another slight change in the yacht's trajectory. By 4:05 a.m. it vanishes from the tracking system after drifting about 400 yards. Surveillance footage recorded from a villa near the Porticello harbour corroborates this moment. 4:06 a.m. At 4:06 a.m. the EPIRB, the Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, a type of GPS that acts as an emergency beacon, automatically sends a distress signal to the Cospas Sarsat satellite station in Bari, managed by the Coast Guard. The yacht, as reported by the 15 survivors, went down bow first in a vertical position before coming to rest on the seafloor, starboard side down. This is really important. 4:10 a.m. At 4:10 a.m., Chiara took out her phone and filmed the scene. The mast lights of the Bayesian were off by this time, leaving only one battery-operated light on the top of the mast. This is, I think, a red light. This suggests the vessel was still upright for as long as 20 minutes after the storm, not 16. And those 4 minutes could be crucial in terms of what the prosecutor decides. 20 minutes is, something like 20% longer for the crew to have effected a rescue or to send out a warning to the fellow passengers. Anyway, the woman said the video shows the vessel sinking at 4:10 a.m., 4 minutes later than tracking data indicates. The video shows the yacht moving fast, then stopping for a short time, about a minute before sinking. 4:15 a.m. By 4:15 a.m., Ballestieri said the yacht was no longer there. She said, "I couldn't understand it. It was calm, and I was thinking, these boats do not sink." During these 16 to 20 terrifying minutes, 15 people managed to escape. The cook, Ricardo Thomas, died trying to get out. The other 6 who were reported missing and have now been found dead fought for their lives until the very end. 4:38 a.m. Investigators have said the flare went up at 4:38 a.m. Although it may seem unkind to investigate the crew, it's basically legal protocol, as we saw in the aftermath to the Titanic. And so what we would want to know is, within this timeline, what was each member of the crew doing? And to some extent, within this timeline, can the movements of some of the passengers be accounted for? Not only the survivors, but those who didn't survive. I'm not going to take it further than that, except to say the captain of the Titanic, although he wasn't, I think, found legally liable, I think morally it's possibly a different story. Did you know that the captain and Isma had a conversation on Saturday, April 13th, just hours before Titanic sank? And a witness, I think her name is Elizabeth Lyons, she said that she overheard the captain saying, "We will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday," meaning they'd arrived one day earlier than originally planned. And it was because of this hubris, because of this ambition, because of this, to some extent, resting on their laurels, on the laurels of the ship, that they pushed the ship harder than they should have, too hard. And this actually led to the Titanic sinking. And one does wonder whether there's similar hubris with the Bayesian. What do you think? Is this a case just of the weather, or is it design and human error and the weather? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.